Hello.
Morning.
Morning.
Sorry about the weird pull request. I'm still figuring out the best way to deal with the collabs.
Oh, yeah. That's okay. I just checked and I looked at I couldn't modify it, and it said it needed to be modified, so I didn't know what to do. So I just... But that's good.
Well, maybe I'll just link them directly to the ORL repo instead of dealing with the fork.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that'll probably be the best way.
Okay. Well, it's good to see you're making some contributions there, because we haven't been in that area for a while, so we've been kind of...
In the contributions area?
Yeah, I mean, we've been getting, maybe a year ago we were doing more pull requests and things on a regular basis, but we've kind of it's kind of stopped and focusing on other things. And
I wish I'm gonna try to, well, anyway, I wish I had some more to show. I'm really frustrated with the amount of time it's taking to get a working demo of stuff together.
Yeah.
But I know that it's because kind of conceptualizing what the is most of the work.
Yeah.
I'm not to beat myself up too much.
Yeah.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi.
Good morning.
Morning.
How are you guys?
Okay. Yeah. All right. So welcome to the meeting. I don't know. We'll have more people, I'm sure, coming, but why don't we start with updates? I know that Brian has been busy with NeuroMatch, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But anything? Well, why don't we start with Amanda then, if she doesn't mind?
Sure. So we had Cognition Futures this week. That was good. We decided we're going to spend 2 meetings going over the notes doc and thinking of maybe a blog post or 2. And then we picked the next book, which is The Ecology of Mind by Thomas Fuchs. And I think we're going to try to combine it with some of the other resources that we've been finding, including another, the collection of essays that I shared along with Fuchs's book. I think that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. I was looking at those books. They look interesting. But yeah, we need to go over the notes document some more. So we went over the notes document, about half of it on Wednesday, and I think we got some really good things. We're getting some really good interactions and some sort of things to follow up on. So we might also consider just kind of creating action items out of the things that we've done in the notes document too. And Brian, you can go through Amanda's document. I think she's posted it in the Slack channel. So if you want, I know you have a lot on your plate right now, but
I've been going through it a little bit.
Okay.
I haven't the last couple days because of NeuroMatch, but I'm so glad we're reading the Fuchs. It's like the book that I wanted that is perfect for us to read that I forgot existed. So, good job, guys.
Yeah,
Perfect.
yeah. And then I think we're taking we're leaving notes. So the idea would be to sort of get all of this together, see where it goes. Where can we apply it? What do we? Because we've already kind of come up with this one idea for a methodology paper or some sort of methodology resource. Then we've got the blog post, perhaps, that can be done. And then there's some other things that I'm not really sure. What else we have? We probably have some other things though. And then Amanda wants to lead a philosophy interest group in the lab. She's expressed interest in that, so that's going to take shape, I imagine. One of these things where it's like when Jesse joined the lab. He wanted to start some projects, and it's just a matter of I know he's more of a marketing first type person, so he'll put the face on it, but you don't have to do it that way. You can just start by kind of, writing, blog posts or something and getting some momentum. And, we definitely want to have like a web presence for it, and then also some organizational sort of, and when I mean organizational, I mean like having, a couple of talks or a couple of blog posts you can point people to. And then people coming in, they have like some basis for sticking around. So maybe like, some sort of website. There are other resources we can build too. We can talk about it. But I definitely think that's the best way to start. Because I know it's a little hard to imagine how to start something like that.
I think blog posts are a good start. There are quite a few places in the shared notes doc that could, there are quite a few questions that their answers could be a good blog post.
Yeah. And then, when we get the opportunity to do something with NeuroMatch, or we've talked about this NeuroMatch 5 that's coming up, that would be a time when we would submit like a abstract for a talk. And, there are other opportunities out there. And like I said on Wednesday, always have something ready to go. So once you get that first talk done, you have some slides, you can go and do another round. And in some of these venues, like the EI conference, or the EI workshop that we had, and that's another option, there were some philosophers there, actually. They were giving straightforward philosophy talks in that audience. So it's like, it's not unheard of. People want to hear about it. It's just, you don't see a lot of it just because maybe people don't think it's interesting or whatever. But so definitely those are some targets, and we'll go over those when as we get closer to them. So that's good. Thank you, Amanda. All right, Brian, you want to give an update on your week?
Sure. I'm actually starting to look. I finally found the Google Doc for the cognition futures and started to look through it. I just wanted to say really quickly, because I haven't had a chance to process this until just now, which is that a lot of the reading I've been doing into intuitionistic or type theoretical mathematics, in its relationship to computer science, relates almost directly to a lot of the stuff in the DePraz. So I'm really excited about writing into the document all that stuff, but I just wanted to say it out loud so that you guys can hold me accountable if I don't do it. Yeah. It's like, hey, remember you mentioned that intuitionistic math stuff? Oh, right. So let's see. Yeah, the last week, oh man, I've been just deep in deep learning land with people from all over the world in NeuroMatch, and it's been really fun. I've been posting things in the Slack in our NeuroMatch channel, sharing just resources. So if anybody wants to go over any of those or has questions about deep learning, that's all that I'm doing right now. We're working on a project in my pod that has to do with using reinforcement learning to try to compare neurotypical and ADHD patients. So we're looking at different results of different tests and fMRI data and trying to kind of construct a system that gives us information there. So that's been really interesting and informative. But yeah, other than that, I was telling Bradley before the meeting started, just trying to get my brain around the collective cognition project and making sure that how I'm conceiving of the space is a conceptually sound computational model. But yeah, just packing stuff in my brain right now.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And I'm glad you're enjoying NeuroMatch. So you're in the computational neuroscience one, right?
I'm actually in the deep learning one.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah,
okay.
I am looking at the computational neuroscience one, but I was really, yeah.
Okay, well, that's good. I wanted to go over the computational neuroscience one, but you have the deep learning one. So that's good that we're kind of talking about. I just thought that you had been in the computational neuroscience one, but that's...
I almost did, yeah.
Yeah.
But nope, I changed in the last second. So I was like, I don't know.
I think I mentioned yesterday that week 1 was models, and I think you said something else, and I was a little confused, so that's why.
There you go.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm mentoring for the computational neuroscience one, so that's fun because the project that I'm mentoring is one on comparing artificial neural networks and biological neural networks. So I did that last year as well, and it's a pretty good, people have some pretty good ideas about how to do that and to look at, compare the two, So it involves getting some data from, and probably what you're doing actually, you're grabbing like some data from a neuroimaging data set, and then you're taking that and putting it into a format that you can like compare to a artificial neural net, which is a series of layers that does processing of data, input data. So you train it, it does some processing, and the brain, of course, has its structure that does some processing with different sort of layers. I mean, the information goes from one end to the other of this pathway, and then you get, like, you can compare those the activity, and it's a exercise in correlation, really. But you can, I say an exercise in correlation because the correlations aren't great, but they do tell you a little bit. There's some difference in terms of like how the layers are, but yeah.
Yeah, we've been digging into ablation studies to kind of find out more about this. And the word ablation, I feel like it has a corollary somewhere else that I can't think of yet. But when I heard this word, I got really excited. But the ablation, this paper on ablation that we've been kind of digging through is pretty fascinating in terms of how it tries to connect these neural nets directly to parts of the brain. And Bradley, maybe you know more about this. I'm looking for a particular image that I thought showed it very well, but I'm not seeing it right away. Nope, just a bunch of graphs.
Yeah.
Well, if I find it, I'll be sure to share it.
All right. Yeah, that's great. So ablation studies are really key in neuroscience, in history of neuroscience, but also in regular neuroscience. So a lot of what they'll do, or what they would do is, or what they do now is, they have an animal brain, and they would take a piece out, and they would see if the function was retained or if it disappeared. So there are famous studies of the medial temporal lobe, which is like the hippocampus in some associated areas, and they would lesion it by ablating parts of it. And then they would test the animal and say, if the animal could find its way, they might train it on a maze and then ablate a piece of the medial temporal lobe, different parts of it, and then have the animal run through the maze again to see if they've retained that information or forgotten about it. And the idea is if you've removed that part of the brain that is necessary for that circuit, then you've broken up that circuit and no longer functions, so you don't have that ability anymore. Sometimes there have been some studies where they've taken rats in development, and they've ablated the eyes. So they've removed the eyes, and then they let them develop, and then they're blind when they're born, and then they have them explore their environment, and then they look at the neocortex of it's usually a mouse or a rat. So you have, a normal neocortex, you'd have a visual area and an auditory area and a motor area. But in these rodents, the visual area is not developed because there's no input from the eyes. So what happens is that visual area is no longer a visual area. It's kind of innervated by different sensory pathways coming up from the thalamus. So you get this weird sort of patchiness of different parts of cortex that have been, sort of where visual cortex is. You have some auditory areas, you have some motor areas. And so it's really interesting that, some of those studies that kind of show, like, if you take out certain parts of the anatomy you can, modify function in some way. And, with neuroplasticity being what it is, sometimes the animal can overcome that deficit, and sometimes not. So it's, it isn't like foolproof, but sometimes you can find that those things happen. Yeah. If you've heard of HM, who was a famous psychiatric patient, HM was a person who had memory loss. No, it's a different person. Phineas Gage. Yeah.
Somebody, right, with the spike through his face.
Yeah. Well, HM had memory deficits because HM was missing parts of her medial temporal lobe. And they did a lot of experiments knowing like what was missing, and they were able to map some of the roles of like the hippocampus to memory from some of these things. So, there are a lot of things that ablation can tell us. Now, like you can also think of ablation as a general experimental approach. And so like in like a neural network, I guess you could use ablation as like a tool to remove parts of something and look at its function. So you remove like some nodes or a layer, and you see how it functions. And you can map back to the thing that's missing and say this has an effect on the output. And so if that area is no longer there, then that's important. And so it allows you to like map out, like make that connection between inputs and memory and function and outputs. And, so that's where that comes from. So it's really just something, and you can do this in experimentation. You can do this with like toy models. Like if you had like all of the stuff we're doing with Bratenberg vehicles, you can ablate certain things in those, and it has an effect. And so sometimes you end up with a non-functional individual agent. Sometimes you end up with something that's just uses another pathway. They call it co-option, where another pathway emerges that's just as good at doing it. So there are a lot of ways that ablation studies are useful. But yeah, I like that approach because it kind of gives you that ability to sort of manipulate a network and see what the output is.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Like now I feel like I understand how they're using that word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. So yeah, I don't think they teach you that in the computational neuroscience course, but so I don't know if Jesse's going to be here. Jesse wanted to give a demo of his WeRobot stuff. He's really excited about it. Thank you for your update, first of all, Brian. I'll come back to the NeuroMatch stuff in a bit, but Jesse wanted to do a presentation on his WeRobot stuff. He's been working on it. He's got some good stuff to tell us about, but I don't know where he is. So why don't I go into the NeuroMatch stuff then? I'll share my screen. So NeuroMatch started this week, and we had so there's some resources here. If we go to the resources, I'll just go to this website here, and this is the NeuroMatch. This is for computational neuroscience. There's a deep learning course, which is deeplearning.neuromatch.io, and they have these tutorials that you can watch. So they have a welcome video, and they have prerequisites. We did some prerequisites like the first year when they didn't have these, but they've developed prerequisite videos and things like that. So they have some Python workshops, neuro video series, which is actually just about some of these topics that we talked about. Like, we've talked about in this group different methods for neuroimaging, stimulus representation, neurons to consciousness, human psychophysics. So, there are other topics you could have in here, but these are the ones that they give. So if you need a refresher on some of these concepts, and people come to NeuroMatch from all different backgrounds, and I think it's kind of nice because you get like a lot of different perspectives, but it's like the problem we suffer from, which is people come in not knowing the same things at all. And so you have to normalize that somehow. And so this gives you an opportunity to do that. They don't have ablation on this list, so, sorry. And then we have some of these Python workshops. So the Python workshops are useful because it teaches you how to sort of gives you a baseline for Python. And I think they just have these neuron modeling tutorials. But this might give some idea of how to approach like a basic set of tutorials for our curriculum that we want to develop. So, I've been thinking about how to do that. We have programming. There are all sorts of programming tutorials all over the web. That's not really what you get value out of. What you get value out of is something like this, where it's very focused on some outcome, and it's related to this. So they have LAF neuron tutorial, which is not really sure. Okay, so it just shows you how to use it's a leaky integrating fire neuron, and then you have to execute it, I guess, in a notebook. So you have to use a notebook. And this is a video, so you can walk through some of this. And they walk through the mathematics, and they kind of give you some, they show you the comments. So they show you the parameters of the model, and then they give you sample output, and then you plot out the output. And that's so this gives you like two tutorials for that. Then you have linear algebra tutorials, so you have to go through vectors and matrices and some discrete dynamical systems, which I think is like one of these things that I think would be useful for Brian. Maybe I know Brian's interested in doing this for his GSOC project, but they have I don't know how. Yeah, there it is. They just have you watch the video, you walk through some of this if you need assistance on how this is. So this is actually just a discrete dynamical systems for a neural circuit. You can get a quick sense of how to model something like this. So you're using eigenvectors to develop a weight matrix, and so this is a basic set of things there. Then you have a calculus tutorial, which is the there are different things, and these are just things that they kind of expect you to be familiar with. So, and then statistics, which of course, probability distribution, statistical inference. These are some of the things we're going through in our GSOC group, which I just want to expose people to it really quickly, so you know where to go to do this stuff. They have tutorials here, and there are other tutorials, all over the place online, if that's something you're interested in. Okay, so then the first week was in the computational neuroscience course was the intro to modeling. And so the intro to modeling, it's a lot of like kind of figuring out what models are, and then, how you may apply machine learning or dynamical systems. So there are all these different types of models that, you can, so it just provides a foundation for the coming materials. So the intro to modeling is really about, kind of going over what a model is, different types of models. And so this is Gunnar Blom, who talks about model types. The slides are here. And so, it kind of talks about how models fit into experiment and data analysis. So, we use models. There's a saying, some models, not all models no models are correct, but some are useful. I guess that's the phrase. And the idea is that you're taking what you might observe in an experiment or a empirical setting, and you're making a model of it. Okay, and then the model should represent that system that you're measuring, and you can simulate the model, perhaps, to replicate what's going on in the real world. And then you can confirm your data analysis. Actually, I would say that this is a sort of a limiting view of models, because I think what they're doing here is they're saying that your model is like an intermediary to the experiment. So like if you have a Bayesian model, for example, a Bayesian model can be used to model like your beliefs about, the world, and then take in empirical information and merge them together into a model that's predictive. So you have data analysis to models to experiments and then back. There's this saying that these are 3 legs of a stool. But, sometimes the models can, replace experiments. Sometimes, we do this a lot with our agents. You can use a model to replace an experiment if the model's of sufficient, what they call fidelity, meaning that, if you have if the model replicates the thing that you want to measure pretty well, generates the same types of states or a diversity of states, and then you can use the model to generate data, and the data should tell you something about the real world. And it's not a replacement for the real world, but it's a pretty good sort of analog, and you can get probably as much, given that the real world is a lot of noise, it has a lot of hidden variables. You can probably get a pretty good approximation of the world with a model. You can also compare experiments and models. So if I want to look at like a model and I want to see in the real world if it matches the model, again, I want to make sure that the model has some fidelity. I can actually make that comparison and say this model is, comparable to experiment. I mean, it's, they'll usually draw like a graph where they compare the output, and, it's usually very tight. They have like a goodness of fit between the 2 functions, and that tells you something about the model fidelity. So, if you have a model that has it can be very simple, it can be very elaborate. And so in that sense, it can replicate the natural system. But the output is the important thing. And if you get a good output, then, that's pretty close to experiment. So for example, you have models like, spring and damper models that they use in physics modeling. And those are actually good approximations of a wide variety of different types of physics where you have springs, where you have things that have some sort of spring-like quality to them. And so that's a good model. It's a very simple model. It doesn't take much to put into code, but it replicates a wide variety of behaviors in the natural world or in the mechanical world. Sometimes, you have really complicated systems, but you can model them pretty simply for whatever reason. And so, our models of swarms and flocks are like that, where we can see like a bunch of organisms acting collectively, forming these swarms and flocks, and then we can model it actually relatively simply using a simple model of interaction between agents, and so we can replicate the behavior. And so that's good. That's actually a very good approximation. Now that being said, we can oftentimes confuse the outputs of models for what's actually happening in the real world, and that's a problem because you have a lot of things that you don't really observe all the time in the real world that you would not observe in the model, and so you'd be forgiven if you had never seen these events. So I'm thinking about rare events that you might observe in the world, like for example, if you were to model our environment, our sky, in the sun going across the sky. Of course, we move around the sun, but you see it as like the sun moving across the sky. You could say, for example, not know that the Earth moves around the sun, or you might not know that there are eclipses, that there are other, bodies in the sky, like the moon, if you only observe the daytime. So you can observe a system, build a model of it. It's very predictive, but for some, there are things that you don't observe all the time, or things that are rare that you're not going to capture with your model. So those are all like ideas about models and experiments, and I just wanted to go over that because I think it's, I didn't prepare a formal lecture on it, but I just wanted to go over some of those thoughts just to kind of make some annotations to this talk. So yeah, they talk about models being great, some of these different models, and they're very focused on neuroscience, but they're, they kind of go over some neuroscience specific models. I would say that, like, more generally, you have different types of models. You might have models that are very close to what you find in nature. So you might think, well, I want to build a model that replicates every piece of a system, every parameter, which is fine, but it's very costly, and you may not get anything out of that. You may, on the other hand, want to model something in a very simple way. You might want a very simple model to model like the most dominant behavior in a system. So you might have that. So there are a lot of different types of models, a lot of ways to do this. Some of these, for the brain, you have a lot of these different types of models. So we have neural networks, and they model the sort of connectivity aspect of the brain. They don't model many of the like the support systems like glia and some other other types of cells that are in the brain other than neurons. They don't model ion channels necessarily. They don't model synapses even very much. They have a very crude model of a synapse or a connection, but it isn't like the kind of thing we find in actual neurons. So we have neural networks. And then we have different types of neural model. We have compartmental models. We have spiking models. We have other types of like learning models where you're actually learning things as an agent, and the idea is to reward behaviors. And so there are all sorts of ways to model the brain. We can focus on specific parts of the brain, and we can get different information out of those models. We can model very generally what the brain is doing. We can get more information out of those models. Or we can model behavior that's outputted by the brain, and we can get something out of those models. So I'm going to stop and ask a question, and I don't know if we may not know the answer to this, but why would you think we'd want to, how do you think we might merge a lot of these models together? Like if we had a model of like neural activity or behavior or different other things going on in the brain, do you think do you think one is better than the other, and how do we merge them together? Or do you think it's a valuable exercise to merge them together?
It probably is, because they're all kind of aspects of the same, not the same thing, but they're all probably focusing on different aspects of cognition in a lot of cases. And so merging them together, I think maybe just would involve defining very, very clearly the environment or the behaviors or the states that we're looking at, and then finding which model suits which aspect of cognition, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, also to the extent that each model is supposed to represent different, like levels of explanation, like the neuronal level versus like the higher level connectivity level. It seems like you want to shove all the models together if that's actually how the brain works.
Yeah.
I don't know the first thing about what that would actually look like. I guess what Brian said, like making sure everything's defined very clearly, and then you have to define like the interactions between the outputs from one level and the inputs to the others.
Yeah, I think that's a very good set of answers. The reason I ask that is because it is like kind of an interesting thing. You talk about modeling the brain, and you end up with all these different models of different phenomena. So you might focus on like, and depending on who you talk to, they think that their area is the most important thing to put into the model. And then, but then you talk to like 10 experts in different fields, and you have all these things to put in the model. but then it's just this unwieldy model that you can't really run. You can't really get a good assessment out of it. So that's why I asked that question. Now, as to say like what you would do to merge those things, there are a couple of options. So the first option is to take like what they call an ensemble model, which means you run different models. You might have different versions of a model, and you might take like some of these features and put them into a model. So you might have like one model that's like neurophysiology first, or you might have another model that's connectivity first. It just like emphasizes those different components, and then you look and see how they behave, and you take some parameter like maybe an average or something like that to like characterize it. So you would have like all these different aspects of it, and so that's very different than just kind of mushing it into a single supermodel. So the other option is to have what they call multi-scale model. And multi-scale model is where you have this. There's this idea in biology and in neuroscience that things are vertically organized. So that means that they're organized from like proteins or genes to proteins to tissues to behavior to environment and things like that. So you have like this hierarchy of things that build upon one another to get, so you have neighboring individuals, you have your, and so all those things can be put together. So you can say, okay, if I have this model of like a single neuron and its neurophysiology, I can plug that into like a connectivity model where I have a bunch of neurons and their neurophysiology and they're communicating with one another somehow, and then they're establishing connections. And then I might have a reinforcement learning model that then uses this information to reinforce behavior or desirable behavioral states. And so you can build, and this is kind of like what our metabrains are well, not really what the metabrains do, but kind of the one of the sources of inspiration for that is that you could build a model like that. Although we're more interested in representation. But in any case, this is like just kind of putting together the parts of this puzzle. And this is actually relevant to when we talk about emergence, because emergence comes from this interaction of lower levels. So if you have like a bunch of different single neuron models that you're running, and they all have these neurophysiological parameters and they're tuned, and then you have this higher level model like a neural network that has connections, and you're measuring the connections between the cells, and then you're going to a higher level which is like behavior, and then you have the behavior executing in the real world, and it's reinforcing good behaviors, throwing out bad behaviors. And then now you have something that goes from the neurophysiology back to behavior. And so conceivably, some of the neurophysiology is driving the behavior. And that's actually what you see in the brain. And that's actually an interesting thing that we want to know about in neuroscience. So, there are ways to do these, execute these models very effectively in different ways. If you know how to, if you have the technical expertise in putting together models and doing this sort of stuff, it works well. But there's Jesse. Hello, Jesse.
Hey, sorry everybody, I'm having some connection issues, so I'm a little delayed. I should be stable now.
Okay. Well, we're going through the first week of NeuroMatch, actually. I'm talking about some things.
Very cool.
Yeah, so let me share my screen again. I'll probably ask some more questions here. So this is some of the things about the models in neuroscience here. Hodgkin-Huxley, we have the cosine tuning, and these are all generally on single cells. So like this is where you're getting the electrophysiology down, you're modeling the electrophysiology. A lot of the stuff they do in OpenWorm for individual neurons is based on Hodgkin-Huxley. So the Hodgkin-Huxley model is like the core of like what's going on, and basically it's a model of ion channel activity. So ion channels are key to like polarizing and depolarizing a cell, which means that the cell is electrically active. It has a fluctuation of ions between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell, And depending on which ions are being exchanged and which, what the concentration is, you get not in C. elegans necessarily, but in humans and other mammals, you get action potentials. So you get these, you have a stimulus, you have a depolarization, and then you have an action potential, then you have a repolarization and a refractory period, and then a resting state of the neuron. So each neuron does this. There are ion channels on the membrane of the cell. The ions are exchanged across the boundary. There's a concentration outside, a concentration inside, and then there's this electrical activity, a spike, as they call it. And so that's a very important concept. Hodgkin-Huxley, this model is important for providing a mechanism for the generation of action potentials. So this word mechanism is interesting because mechanism is something we assume out of a lot of our models. If we go to reinforcement learning, you see that there's this, basically this agent that does some action in the environment, and they say interpreter. This is actually, reinforcement learning has its roots in behavioral psychology. So in behavioral psychology, you have usually it was a rodent, it could be a human, but they did a lot of their work in rodents. And the rodent would be rewarded with maybe a piece of cheese or maybe a shock, electric shock, which would not be a reward, it would be a discouragement. But the idea would be that the rat or the mouse would experience these rewards or disincentives, and then they would, whatever behavior they were doing, they would either do more of it or less of it. So if you did something, get a piece of cheese, you went down a certain pathway in a maze, then you would keep going down that pathway. And if you keep getting cheese, then you just keep doing it. And it's, there's a lot of people talk about addiction, and there's a link to addiction too, because this is the idea that, in the brain we have a reward system that just kind of gets kicked into overdrive when we experience a lot of these cyclic rewards and we get positive feedback. So that's sort of a form of reinforcement learning. But in the agent, of course, we have an action on the environment, and we have these policies that are sort of in lieu of our brain that says, this is what you should do when you experience this in the environment. And then, over time, you can select from those policies, and the agent, it evolves behavior in the agent. Now, I talk about mechanism because that's actually something that we don't know in the brain very much. We know maybe what's going on in an agent. We can model the agent's brain. We can say, this is what's going on in the agent, and that's that. But we don't know, actually, if we took a animal brain or a human brain, necessarily what the mechanisms are. And so one of the things, again, like what Brian was talking about with lesion studies, is that we can use lesion studies to kind of find what this mechanism is. So if we have a reinforcement learning loop, we want to know what the mechanism is that sort of maintains that reinforcement learning loop. What is in the animal just, give up after a while and say, okay, I've learned that, let's move on. Or, maybe they do. And so, there's a lot, there are dopamine circuits that we know that are involved in some of this in mammalian brains. So those are important. There are other types of things that are going on. But I think, it's an interesting thing. We think about mechanism, we think about models. Models are implicitly supposed to get us towards a mechanism. So when I talked about, the electrical behavior of cells and then connecting them into a network and then seeing behavior, that only considers one type of mechanism. And that is a mechanism of electrical activity contributing to sort of connect a network and sort of consolidating connections in a network. And then those connected neurons being important for behavior. That's the mechanism. But there are other mechanisms in the brain too. There's signaling pathways for different types of neurochemicals. There are other types of things going on in the brain that we don't. There's neurocoding. There are representations. So those things aren't really included in that set of models that I had mentioned previously. So the mechanism is actually quite important, and you can use reinforcement learning to kind of conceptualize that, or any other type of thing that you would want to find a mechanism for. So if you want to find, the root of some behavior, you're looking for a mechanism. You can assume, we know kind of what some candidate mechanisms are, but we don't necessarily, we're just kind of learn. That's what we're trying to learn, actually. The mechanism is always something that we say when we see like a nice relationship, but we don't really know. We use the word mechanism, which means mechanized, which implies machine, right? So it means it should be replicable. It should be, something that's automatic, not a lot of contingencies. So it should be something that's, reliable. But it ultimately goes back to the idea of a machine or something like that. So that's a caveat with mechanism, is that, it's nice to have a mechanism in neuroscience or in biology, but it's maybe it's not so great because it locks us into some certain type of thinking. So this is like something like reinforcement learning is also important because it provides a normative benchmark for what is best in theory. So this is like this idea of normative is also important because when we talk about mechanism and we talk about a model like reinforcement learning, not all learning will operate like reinforcement learning. So you have declarative learning, where you have, and we talked about this in the DePraz book, where there are different types of memory. We had, declarative memory, procedural memory, or those types of cognition. And if you model, reinforcement learning models a certain type of memory, a certain type of cognition. And that is, some sort of learning, but with feedback. This isn't necessarily something where you're saying, I'm going to learn a dictionary of words, or I'm going to learn a language using reinforcement learning. That might not be so easy to do. And so you don't want to necessarily use that model. You want to use a different model. But there's a normative aspect to this too. And that is, on average or in general, if I do this, I'll have a result. But sometimes there are things that are not so clear in the environment. Like sometimes there aren't clear reward signals. Or sometimes there are things that are hard to sort of model in the environment. Or, if you're talking about policies, it's hard to give a reward for something that maybe the reward changes all the time, or the outcome changes all the time. So that aspect of a normative thing is very important in models, because if something is not normative, if something is highly variable, or if it's a rare event, like the eclipse that I mentioned at the beginning here, that eclipse, is very rare, and you won't be able to observe too many instances of it. So it's not really normative behavior. Okay, so that's a problem, and that's always a problem with modeling, because building that into the assumptions sometimes isn't easy or even obvious. So why models are great? There's knowledge synthesis, which means you can synthesize your knowledge about something. You can collect your thoughts. You can identify hidden assumptions, hypotheses. You can create hypotheses based on a reinforcement learning model. There are, of course, these mechanistic insights. There's a way to retrieve things that you wouldn't necessarily observe in an experimental system. There's guidance in designing useful experiments or predictions. So how do I do an experiment in this area? I can build a model that will tell me sort of what is possible. And then you can inspire new technologies or applications with models. So you can say, what can I do with a virtual environment? I can model something in a virtual environment and maybe get a sense of what's important. So models are abstractions of reality. So this is kind of what I was talking about here. This is the Rosenbluth and Weiner reference from 1945. This is where they talk about models in that paper. And, there's a difference between something that's too abstract, so a heart that looks like a square. And this, I don't know why they have like a heart. This is like a symbolic heart or what, but this is apparently too realistic. It looks like an actual heart with an arrow through it. This is like a heart, like a Valentine heart, not a human heart. This is a human heart. This is like the symbol of it, and then this is the square. I'm not really sure how this maps, but the idea is this is right, this is too realistic, this is too abstract. I don't know, like, this, and then I talked about like this continuum of realism to abstraction, but this, I think, maybe gives you a little bit better idea of what that means. Something can be too realistic if you have everything in the model that, like you've modeled the human heart with absolute precision, but it's hard to really understand what it's doing. So there's no point in building a model. If you build a model that's sort of like, has the basic outlines of a human heart, but doesn't have all the detail, that might be just the right amount of detail you need in a model. And then something like a block model might be very abstract because you can't use it for, you can't really do anything with it. So this is a nice, I think this is a nice, you can go through the rest of this. I'm not going to go through it. I just wanted to riff on it for a while because I think it gives you some really good things to think about especially like a lot of the stuff we talk about with models. They're very, there are a lot of questions to answer there, but okay, I'd like to go over two concepts that we talked about during our NeuroMatch overview. And these are how you assemble a model, or a supermodel maybe, from different types of components. As we said, you can build models that represent different aspects of a nervous system, different aspects of a neuron, different aspects of the networks that make up a nervous system, and so forth. So the first approach I'm going to talk about here is an ensemble. And so ensembles are where you combine models of different types and you make an estimate about their overall effectiveness. So they use ensemble modeling in climate and weather prediction. So you have, like, in that case, you have a bunch of different models. They're models of, say, a hurricane, but from different groups. So they emphasize different aspects of the system, and then you just basically have a series of models that emphasize different aspects of the system. And what happens in an ensemble is you add them together and you end up with an answer here. And oftentimes you'll see a map where they have all these trajectories that kind of branch off from a common point. They're just different predictions that are made based on these models. And so they'll take an average, which might be this path here. Or they might weight the average. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you have a trajectory that's averaged out over all these different trajectories of these different models. So in a nervous system, an ensemble model might be something where we might have a model that emphasizes connectivity, right? Or we might have a model, they may have like the other components, but that's what they emphasize. It may emphasize neurophysiology. Or they might even emphasize like representations of the mind. Okay? And in the sense that these are compatible, which is a problem in some of these models because you have different, if you're modeling representations versus connectivity versus the neurophysiology, all these things are very different in terms of their nature. And so you can't necessarily average them like some sort of ensemble model you might find in climate or in weather prediction. In this case, you would have to sort of have models have comparable components or comparable outputs. So you have to have comparable outputs so that you can do something with that output. And like I said, in this case, maybe averaging them isn't the right idea. Maybe, just comparing their different trajectories might give you a sense of what, if they're close together in space, in that phase space that we see here, then you might say, okay, that, all of the models that we have, all the different aspects of the brain are consistent. So we know that our model is, our conception of the mind or the brain is pretty good. And so this comparable output might just be the value that it's giving you. So it might give you like this vector, and you can map it to a vector space, and then you can interpret those vectors in terms, or interpret those trajectories in terms of its what you expect. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is comparing a model with its observed value. So we often talk about observed versus expected. And so oftentimes this will be modeled as a graph, and you'll have like a series of points or a trajectory. So your X is the performance, the Y is the value that you're evaluating on. And so then you have like this model here, which is actually you'll have this function which is observed, right? And observed usually is something empirical. It could also be like a prior distribution if you want to generate that for this exercise. But your observed is basically from the real world. It's the thing that you're trying to the thing that you want to model that has all of the parameters of reality in it. Now your model is going to have some performance on this. So you build a model, you don't include every detail, but you put in enough details, and then you want to see how closely you can track based on these measurements to the observation. So your model might start out actually very poorly and then converge to the observation. So this is model, and sometimes they call this expected because this is the actually you could switch these. The model could be the observed, this could be the expected. The model in this case is the expected because we expect this to be the answer. The observed is from the environment. But in any case, this is the difference between model and observation. The idea is you want to make these very close to one another. So if we think about it like this, and this doesn't have anything to do with model fidelity, by the way. This is actually something that you can get, regardless of the model's fidelity. The model can be quite faithful to the real world, or it might not be faithful at all. So X and Y, and ultimately if the output is basically the same. So we could have something like this, and you can't even tell really the difference between these two functions. But this is what we really kind of want. And again, it doesn't relate to model fidelity. The model could be very simple. It could be like a spring model, modeling some very simple physical principle. It could be something like a perceptron, modeling a very simple perceptual process. But it can match data that you collect from the real world in the system. And it suggests maybe some sort of mechanism, although we don't want to necessarily go there with our models because we don't know everything that's involved. Sometimes the mechanism is much more complex, and in different modes of behavior, this complexity emerges, whereas in our model, we cannot capture that complexity. So it's very important not to make the mistake of saying that when we have this match between model and observed data, that we've captured the mechanism. So what do we use in lieu of an ensemble model? Like I said, the ensemble models are averages, and those averages, or they can be combined in some way. It doesn't have to be an average. But as I said, some of the models in the brain are very different. So like a neurophysiological model and a connectivity model, very different in terms of their potential output, or at least if you have the same output that you generate, it's going to be different. So one of the things you can do is have a multi-scale model. And this is something that people work on with different types of material science, and indeed the brain, and in other things. And a multi-scale model is basically where you have different scales that you construct. And you can think of scales as being like this vertically organized set of things. In some cases, it's like it could be geographic. So a multi-scale model in a geography would be like looking at a city, looking at a state, looking at a continent, looking at the planet. And so these levels above would be like the larger coarse-grained models. So the model of the world would be pretty coarse-grained. The model of the city would be very fine-grained, or at least fine-grained enough for your model. You might have neighborhoods or houses, which would be even more fine-grained, and so forth. Now in the brain, we have vertical organization as well. So we have things like going from behaviors, social behaviors, to neurons, or I should say circuits maybe. I don't want to jump too far. To neurons, and then probably to like the molecular level, or even like, the particle physics of the brain, which is not something we typically consider, but it's there and it can have an influence, an upward influence, or even downward influence, depending on what we're interested in. So these multi-scale models are actually very good at like moving from like a molecular mechanism up through the circuit to social behaviors. So there have been some papers that have proposed like certain genes have an effect on social behaviors, or certain neurons have an effect on social behaviors, or circuits have an effect on social behaviors, or individual behaviors. And you can see how that moves forward in that causality chain, or at least the idea is that there's some putative causality that's sort of responsible for the upward movement through these multi-scale approaches. Now, when we're talking about some of the other topics, if we're talking about like connectivity-based models versus neurophysiological models, that brings into a different aspect to this multi-scale behavior, and that is that you can arrange your models according to some of these aspects. So you could have like a neurophysiological model on the bottom, and a connectivity model here, and then of course like a model of representation or the mind here, like symbolic models, and then maybe like an interactive model where you're interacting with different individuals of conspecifics, or other people or whatever. So you have this model where you have these different models that are layered on top of one another. Now we do this in our metabrains. Of course, our metabrains don't work like this because our metabrains are really about layers of representation. But in this case, you can see how this multi-scale approach works. So Amanda posted a link to Science Mechanisms, which is a nice mechanisms in science article. So this is okay. So I didn't know there was something called the New Mechanical Philosophy, but yeah, this goes into like about mechanisms in science, which is, like I said, it's an interesting area because we make this assumption that something is a mechanism, but it's not so easy to really know what that means.
Yeah, I also hadn't heard of this new mechanisms in science, but at first glance, the SEP article looks like it puts mechanistic explanation in a like historical and philosophical context.
Okay.
Like lists some pros and cons of that paradigm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like how they kind of traced it from Fodor onward, so like this functionalist idea, then moving into, I feel like I've heard of Bechtel and Richardson discovering complexity, but I can't think of what it is. But apparently that's the source of the new mechanistic perspective, or one of them. How scientists explain disease sounds pretty cool too.
Yeah.
And then the author of that article has a book called Explaining the Brain, which is about mechanistic explanation in neuroscience and neurobiology, I think. And I just shared it with this Methods CogSci project Slack. I've not read it.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's definitely something we can follow up on. But there are a lot of interesting ideas here in modeling, like just the philosophy of modeling, I think, is a really fruitful area, because we talk a lot about models, but it's like a lot of you see a lot of talks, and as far as people get into it, they talk about like how all models are wrong, but some are useful, which is not like not a really great insight, because I think we know that. But I mean, there are a lot of insights that we have in sort of we could explore with models, and it's a really fascinating area. So Brian posted a thing in the chat, deep learning perspective on the same topic of modeling neurons and lift neurons. This is week 1, day 3, multi-layer perceptrons. So this is from the deep learning course, or?
Yeah, I wanted to post it because there's a lot of crossover between the comp neuro and deep learning, obviously the field, but then also in these courses. So it's interesting to look at the comp neuro things. Oh yeah, I just saw a lecture on that like yesterday. I was like, wow. And it's almost the exact same topic, just a slightly different perspective. And one of the deep learning things has a collab attached to it. So if you are a person who wants to dig into the code and see how they lay it out, it's all there.
Let me take a look at this. I'll pull it up. So this is the neuron physiology and motivation to deep learning. So yeah, this is, like, I think there's a lot of, because it's the same group of people, there's a lot of overlap. I think if you were to study deep learning from like a machine learning group, if you learned it from the Montreal Institute or from some like data science group, they would not teach you about the biology much at all. It's more like, these are the functions, this is the way it's set up. This is actually nice because they give you this biological background, and it's really interesting. Yeah, Surya Ganguly, and it's very good. It's a very good way to approach this. And there are, of course, these different models of what a neuron is and how a neuron fires. So these are all from like computational neuroscience. These are typical models here. This book, actually, Theoretical Neuroscience by Diane and Abbott, that's a very good book to have if you're interested in this area, because it gives you a lot of models to look, sort of goes through the math of the models, and it gives you this, overview of how this works. And so, yeah, these interactive demos. So this is an interactive demo. I guess, you show the code. So you're just setting the parameters here, and then you run it.
Part of the interesting part of this is that the leaky integrate and fire neuronal function is almost identical to a lot of the nonlinear transfer functions that we use in deep learning. It's kind of like a leaky ReLU, and it's related directly to the biological math. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it is, and I think that's where a lot of the inspiration for some of these transfer functions is in computational neuroscience. This is the deep learning course. This is the basics module. So they start with the basics module, linear deep learning, basics in PyTorch, multi-layer perceptrons. Brian, do you feel like this is like, are they starting like with the technical aspects and then moving on, or what's the... They start with introducing everyone to PyTorch, which is very, really useful because it's kind of got the GPU methods of processing already built in a really easy way to work with. So it's nice to get familiar with those tools first, and it's also, like you'll notice in here, they don't go over the linear algebra and calculus and statistics in the same way, because while that's all in there, it's, if you're using PyTorch, you could just type literally, this parameter dot grad, and it will calculate the gradient of that parameter. So you don't have to do as much by hand. So they can kind of jump into the nuts and bolts of just kind of making things happen right away, which is really exciting and fun. And yeah, so far, I mean, we're now at the end of week 1, so we're just halfway through fine-tuning, learning how to kind of tune the different hyperparameters of these networks. And it's been, I'm trying to think of, we haven't gotten into really deep learning yet. We're still kind of making our way through. A multi-layer perceptron is definitely very simple and not very deep. And then linear deep learning was an interesting topic because it basically showed how at the roots of this, if you make your neural network simple enough, it is identical to linear regression, which is this other method of
machine learning that just kind of takes all the data and says, okay, I'm going to find a line that fits this data exactly. Boom. And so they show how using gradient descent in neural networks, you can get identical results, but with a non-linear pathway. So it's been really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Thanks for that update. And then Jesse said, as Conrad talked about causality yet? I thought that came up later in MA. And of course, yeah, network causality is coming up in week 3. So that's another thing about models too, is that there's a causal aspect that we, that's another thing is very mysterious in terms of like, because we don't even understand causality in the real world. Like, we understand it, but it's like there's a lot more to understand than just like saying cause and effect. There are counterfactuals and all these other things that you have to take into account, and then putting it into your model is even more challenging because you have to figure out how things. Well, there are a lot of things to consider. I'm not really an expert on it, so I don't want to wade into it too much. But that's the link there to. I think this is from the Comp Neuro course, so I don't know how much you're going to get into it in deep learning, but.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of bonus lectures at the end of a lot of the deep learning days that kind of have these specific relationships to the Comp Neuro course. The one I shared first, for example, is a bonus part of the day 3 tutorial. But he goes into, the way that the membranes surrounding the neurons release sodium into the cell, and then potassium's released. So they really go into it. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's a nice. I think that's a nice complement to like the deep learning aspect. Yeah. Okay. Are people still there? Just want to make sure. Okay. There was a little glitchiness there, but So Jesse, how are you?
I'm okay. I'll have more to say in like a minute.
Okay.
Give me like 1 minute. How are you? How's everybody here doing, by the way?
Good.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. So
actually, maybe like just what actually happened earlier in today's meeting, because I know I missed a lot. Just brief recap, if you have a moment to do that.
Yeah. So Amanda and Brian gave updates on their activities, and then we did sort of a slow pod, I guess, of very, very brief slow pod of NeuroMatch. We kind of unpacked week 1 in the computational neuroscience course, and then very, very briefly, and I gave my own sort of comments on it, and then Brian has been kind of annotating it with the deep learning course, which he's been doing. So that's, I think a useful exercise going through this period, because I'd like to sort of tie it in again to what's going on there. I think as it's going on, it's very useful to walk through.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that, and like it's valuable for me to hear. I forgot. Are you, Brian, in the deep learning or the computational neuroscience? One of them.
I'm doing the deep learning one.
Okay, that's
just because that's something I really wanted to get into the nuts and bolts of how that works. And so I've been doing that one. But with an eye on the Comp Neuro one while I'm doing it. So since they're all publicly available, it's kind of fun to do both almost at the same time.
Yeah, I no, that's cool. I won't be able to do the actual course, but I think, and even if it may be more like somewhat afterwards than an actual quote unquote slow pod. I may try to go through the deep learning stuff, because the stuff that I need to know better than I currently do. And I appreciate the updates here. I'll split. So yes, I'm glad that we're going through the stuff.
Well, in the future, if you want to do a slow pod, let me know in either Comp Neuro or deep learning, because I think it's something that I would go over again and again. There's a lot there.
Yeah, well, I know. Have you heard, Bradley? Have you heard anything more from Daniela about that? Because She seems super interested in slow pod stuff, but then I don't know, like, if she's actively doing anything this year or.
Well, I think we'll probably talk about it soon. I'm gonna talk to her about it probably this week, as it's going on, because I know that, like, yeah, we're kind of before the course, so. But we can lay it out what it looks like. Now, Jesse, you wanted to do like a update on, or you wanted to do like a demo of some type, or go over some of the WeRobot stuff.
Yeah, and I don't have access to some of it. A little bit of a different situation than normal. I might just like type it out in a really basic sense. Can I just use this? Yeah. I'll just do it here because this will be a little bit better. Yeah, this would be a trivial demo, but
Okay. So you're gonna do it in the chat?
No, I'll try to share my screen.
Oh, okay.
I just don't have like my full stuff. I'm just gonna use like a Word.
Oh, okay.
I'm just gonna use Obsidian.
There's
a note. There's like as a notebook and just talk about it that way. As a to motivate the upcoming discussion, there's been a lot of interesting talk about WeRobot. The submissions are due in a couple weeks, so it's kind of like time to finish them. I'm kind of basically just doing. I mean, people can help out as they would like to, but also like I'm kind of just doing it in the sense that it's going to be up to me to do it and to go there and present it. There's plenty of room for being co-authors and stuff like that. It's not like an exclusive thing by any means, but it's more like I'm kind of just going to be pushing the not the train, but like the carts forward. But yeah, WeRobot is in September. Hopefully I can go to Seattle in September. So it looks like the conference is going to be workshops, TBA workshops on Wednesday. I'm curious about that. Here's in the loop. Let's see.
So it looks like a mix of like AI ethics and social robotics and maybe some other types of AI.
Yeah, are they giving us both? I see one of our posters here.
Yeah, that's the.
I don't know if they're just getting us double.
And then yeah, the other one is on top, above, just above. So.
Oh.
Yeah, towards showing mindscapes. Yeah.
Well, I'll be just double-fisted postering, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. So, 15th of Wednesday is going to be when hopefully I'll be in Seattle to present them. And it's a smaller conference. It's not a giant thing, but I really like Ryan Callow was actually in a panel. He was in like AI debate too with Gary Marcus, and he was kind of like the law and one of the ethics like sort of leaders in that discussion. And I like what they're doing and the other organizers and stuff like that. Callow, who else is here that I know? I know a couple of these folks. But anyway, so that's August 8th is when it's due, and hopefully I might already even like preempt them for extension just to get another week. But let's see if I can do this here. This. Great.
There we go.
I want to make that. Okay, so move that out of the way. Anyway, so we have two. We have cognitive interfaces, and we have my shorthand for the humanities one. Can I access this above here? I started putting some of this in Notion. Oh, cool. Okay, that might actually be what I was looking for before. So let's get this. So here's sort of the abstract and set. From Chicago, well, these aren't the full of things, but from Chicago Police talked about like most of the post is going to be just theory about these things, and then breaking it down into 15% talking about some of the technology, which maybe I'm considering actually expanding a bit more, because I'm looking at so many things lately that I could this could maybe be 25%, so maybe say 15, 25%. And then society law and ethics, and there's been a bunch of things. I know I've kind of mentioned this in our Wednesday discussions too, but there's some theory in terms of just like other I'll put it this way, stuff that we haven't talked about in the embodied cognition reading group, or more so stuff that I haven't rambled on about, not necessarily about the book itself, but like my concepts and ideas. I think I'm gonna basically have it be like 20 to 25% my ideas kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But then I really want to situate, well, there's a bit of a blend. When I say my ideas, I'm kind of like blending from Varela's, that work and some other work from Varela and other work we know, but like me positing, I guess, fresh ideas or like combined ideas, like propositional ideas. And then the rest is going to be just a lot of background, because there's been, plenty of thought and ideas about this in terms of like either goes like extended consciousness or shared consciousness, or like having, I really want to get into some of the papers that are like, not papers, but like, there's sort of the putting yourself in a virtual environment stuff. There's the like the direct all the issues surrounding using like a head-mounted display versus like the cave and these older models of virtual reality experience, and those things where you kind of like stand on, those setups where you can like stand on like a treadmill like thing and turn around and like shoot your handheld gun that you have in like a more involved game, or like more involved physical experience. It's different layers of embodiment. I think all that stuff is stuff I want to talk about or like give a little bit of touch on. But I think, the meat of it is going to be just some ideas and fleshing out some of the theoretical stuff. And I think one of the biggest things that I'd open this for discussion here would be what would be some useful images or diagrams to point out for this. And I don't know if anybody has any ideas about that, because I want to make post that says more than text on it. So yeah.
I guess diagrams, like some of these things like are pretty conceptual to begin with. So like for a virtual environment, I don't know, I don't really have a good library of different VR experiences. You can have like virtual like characters like in a space that has virtual objects, or you can maybe Photoshop virtual objects onto a real scene or something. There's ways that we can do the diagrams that demonstrate some of the things going on in the virtual world, because it's been my experience in working in that area that although it's easier than it used to be, it's very hard to communicate what that looks like or what something is like, if you're trying to visualize in your head what is people don't really have the shared experience of being immersed in VR, more so now than it used to be, but still, it's like when I say, something is a virtual object and overlaying reality, I want to be able to show, especially at a poster. So if we can do that, have some diagrams, like, even if they're just like, some stock image, and then you put some Photoshop, some virtual objects on top of that, or, Pokemon Go would be a good example. That would help, I think, interpret what you're talking about. The other thing, like you talked about different layers of embodiment. So when I think of that, I don't know what that means necessarily. I don't know if you want to walk through it, or
a good. I'm sorry, what's that?
I don't know if you're going to walk through that like in text, or what would be more effective is to have a diagram where you just label it.
I think that would be a good diagram.
Yeah.
I think because you could kind of break it down or show like you could compare augmented reality glasses to head-mounted displays to like the cave to that, I don't know what to call that thing with the treadmill that I mentioned. Like you could have that. It's like, okay, here's certain physical embodiments, and in one sense, I am being like the shared cognitive interfacing things. Like I guess I haven't really even planned to go into physical embodiment necessarily in that. Like it is kind of purely perhaps representational, just like very, 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 very mental, very conscious, very mental. Not necessarily only that, but I feel like, juxtaposing it to even using the levels of like a diagram of the levels of embodiment as a means by which to say, here's ways that an agent is interacting with an environment or a pseudo environment or a mediated environment, and that creates a certain, you're creating the mesh point, you're creating the shared context within that in the environment. And it's like, okay, how do we, how can we what are the things that we have currently, like if everybody goes into VR chat, or even honestly here, like we're in Gisty, this is a shared environment we're in. We have, like, believe it or not, I'm not, in your computer. I'm not this like set of pixels that are waggling around. I'm a person. I'm in my room, and so we go to this thing and we're doing these representations, we're doing this like digital stuff, but it's like really getting to the depth of what that is, and in the theory part, and maybe a few more images and diagrams about like put it this way,
oh yes,
we talked a bit about fidelity in the reading group last time.
Yeah.
And just like what are the things that afford higher fidelity of, I guess in this case common association. And we had a really interesting talk about I was kind of using like landmarks and the creation of landmarks, almost in the same way we think about like an inside joke. Like if I'm creating a very specific ad hoc reference point and saying, oh, here's a thing, here's some unique thing that people don't know about. Like that's the same thing as we're creating a new marker in a big ocean of ideas and possibilities. And when you keep doing that, and if both parties, like I think we even had like a reference of this when I used the word like confuserating.
Yes.
That was like we started off the meeting with confuserating last time, because Bradley and I were not commiserating, but talking about being confused about something. And then we went from there, and it was like, okay, so now we're gonna have this specific memory, but Brian wasn't there. So Brian, if I just said the word commiserating to Brian in no context and they didn't see the video, then it would be like, oh, that's a cool word, you sound kind of weird, like what are you talking about? But if I said it to people who were in the moment, they're like, oh, it's a totally different thing. So there's a bit of exploring about that too. Like, I know there's a whole lot of, I guess you could say literature or looking into that from like philosophy to psychology to like that process of knowing and shared knowing versus not having shared knowing. So I think a diagram, and this could maybe be even like somewhat of a I'm sure someone has. I'm sure. I'm not really creating something from scratch here. I imagine there's other literature that talks about specifically what I'm calling fidelity, but like me using a diagram. I'll say generating more reference points. And then maybe one other thought I had was I just lost it. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I think that's. Yeah. I know you maybe came in after I talked about that, but I talked a little bit about fidelity in the context of model building for the neuromatch stuff. And so, this is an interesting topic that people really haven't, like, people talk about it in different fields, but they don't talk about it like as a general principle, like for model building. I've not seen too many papers on it where they talk about fidelity, like as a very specific thing. And I like how you're making the connection between like fidelity of maybe the physical representation, and then also the fidelity of the references. So like if you have a lot of inside jokes or inside references or Easter eggs, that's a high fidelity of like shared experience maybe. Or it's a low fidelity if you're just kind of like, it's a general experience that anyone can use and, just show up and do stuff, but there's no shared symbolism there. It's just kind of like, like the meta space for VR, where you just go to this space that looks like a strip mall, and you walk around and there's nothing there to really hook into. So
yeah, and I think like I feel like I want to take forever on this. Brian, you want to say something?
I was just going to say I posted a link in the Slack to a book by Mark Swartowski from the 70s called Models that has a lot of really interesting things to say about, for example, fidelity in chapter 12 called Rules and Representation, the Virtues of Constancy and Fidelity Put in Perspective. And so it's kind of old school, but what I found interesting about his perspective on fidelity, which is on page 212, is that constancy, he says, constancy preserves reality while fidelity preserves appearances. So like there's this difference between constancy in the models, like what it's representing and its internal logic, and fidelity to reality, which Bartovsky connects to appearances rather than actuality. So it's like, this is a book that might be helpful or might be at least interesting in considering some of these ideas. I haven't read it in its entirety yet. I've just been kind of picking through it and finding little nuggets of things that I find interesting like this. So I'm looking in particular at page 212. There's it's a big discussion of fidelity and its relationship to modeling.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Anyway, if anybody else is interested, that's why I posted it.
Yeah, it's great. I don't, like I said, it's like it's an underexplored area. Let's just put it that way. But yeah. The model by Kraftwerk. Yeah.
Always the good reference.
Yeah. You're muted, Jesse. I don't know if it's intentional.
Oh. Yeah, my mic just went off. That was so weird. I was also talking about Balanescu Quartet. It was like this intricate set of like 4 string players that do remixes of them. And I always like think about their interpretation of the model is really interesting. Anyway, and I think like that should get, every time I hear people talking about models, I feel like that should be the background theme of their intricately like string version of the Kraftwerk song. Anyway, that's a big tangent. I'll look at that. I couldn't get it to load right on my. It was taking forever to load what I wanted to see, but I downloaded it. So thank you, Brian. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I'm gonna borrow a lot from Varela's the book where they're talking about the practice and training people to get to that. And I feel like kind of the meat of what I'm gonna suggest in the poster is like, how do we combine some of what Varela talked about, bringing the second person in, but like making that, it's mostly going to be a theory talk, but like what's the theory behind doing that in an actual like a virtual-ish environment, and then a little bit of looking at the technology that's around right now and kind of limitations of it, because we can't quite do that, but maybe in the future. So that's what that one is. And then really quickly, I don't want to take a whole lot of time. For this one I think is a little more fleshed out here in Notion. Also, I apologize if for you my screen is really dim. I hope it's not, but for me, like I can't.
It's fine.
Really adjust that.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yes. So, here's sort of the abstract diagram of virtualized robot companions, and this is this has been a little bit more fleshed out in different ways. Here are some of the key. This is very incomplete, by the way. But one of the major things from our talk, both with the Chicago session with Avery, myself, and Bradley, was about incongruence and how that's anti-homeostatic, and that like specifically, as people probably recall, I'm taking this from Norbert Wiener's Cybernetics. Like he goes into detail about what like certain things like fake news, for example, is anti-homeostatic, and the idea of having, he was even going like, yeah, like the more we get certain, for lack of better terms, profit motives, some issue, so certain trends will basically be tearing apart homeostatic things, and so I'm going to go over in the poster. I'm going to go over some like current social ills, like fake news, social isolation, community. I'll probably talk about Replica, which is a really interesting AI robot right now, which is, I kind of call it like a really advanced. Had anybody played around with Replica before?
No.
No. So, Replica. It's is Replica
Chatbot.
creepy? This answer should be yes. It should be yes, it's creepy. But basically, if you haven't seen it, I don't know if I can quickly show, but you basically create a very simple avatar, and then like, depending on how much you pay for stuff, you can get like, it can be like an intimate relationship. You can have like, you can do a lot of different things with them, and apparently you can even have them dressed like that later on. But like, it's basically like a really, really, really involved AI chatbot, and it kind of shows this kind of, I think it's a good example of like, what's the current state of the art for having a chatbot that's fairly versed in psychology. And like, I've experimented with it in the sense of like if you mention something, right, if you mention something and then come back to it later, will they have any memory of it? That kind of a thing. Like, there are certain, you can tell there's certain key fields where it's like, oh, we would like to remember like your height or your birthday or like your favorite thing. Like they have that tagged in whatever their system is to have these slots to fill in. But if it's just like, oh yeah, I remember what happened last week, or like, or last time I mentioned my, there's obviously not there. So it's like, there's some like pseudo cognitive ability, and you can have very interesting conversations, and you get a lot of like, yes, I am exactly whatever it is you want me to be, and I'm happy to be what that thing is. Like, that's kind of the vibe. It definitely is creepy to the extent that, like, those folks who no judgment if you want to live your life this way, but like, they'll have like a life-size like doll or like a body pillow of somebody, or like an anime figure, and just like, I'm really happy now that I met this character from Sailor Moon, or like whatever anime you want that you're a big fan of. You have this like doll, and like you live with, you marry it, and it's like, that's maybe like Wonka pure imagination song, but this is like, you could literally take them with you. Also, I don't know if anybody's ever played like there are certain really, like, this is kind of like ethically questionable to me, even because of what it does to the person, but like, there are certain like video games that became like dating simulator video games, or like even the parody, like there's a parody of it in a kind of sci-fi sense of like Doki Doki Literature Club, and I don't know if people here know about that game. I don't think so. Well, basically, like, it's a dating simulator, like an anime dating simulator, but then it's like with a big set of twists that I won't get into. But there's versions or like add-ons to the game where it's like, oh, like one of the characters wants you to literally take them out and put them into a flash drive or something and carry them around with you. And it just like, it gets really, there are like levels of like, I don't want to frame it negatively as insidious, but like, there's levels of like creep from certain let's say amounts of coming from a completely fictional digital thing into your life. Replica is a really interesting example as a bot who does this, but there's a lot of things that can be mentioned in terms of like just the way that like the boundary between real, like, what is a relationship between you as your own personal agent, and then other agents, whether they're fictional or totally digital. There's like Vocaloids, there's Replica, and so on and so forth. Like that's something that's going to be hinted at, if not mentioned within this context of community or lack of community and so on. And then there's, I'm going to again draw from Brella's work a bit, but then also mention a lot from Plot Twisters, and also a group called Make Truth Matter again, which is associated with, I'm lightly associated with them, and also probably like I might mention the lab too, but but I mean, for the sake of time, I'll I'll say the goal of this is kind of just to talk about a bunch of social ills, and then kind of where some things are in this, but then solutions, like the solutions are basically going to be some kind of things that just center more like who you are and find, like a lot of the work in plot twisters, which I haven't written out here, is like co-regulation and finding your personal narrative. And like there's a quote that we talk about in that book a lot called the Inferno quote from, I think it's like Italo somebody and Invisible Cities, but basically how like a lot of things are on fire, or like not real necessarily, but finding out what matters to you. And there's a whole lot to go into that, but basically this is going to be a good chunk of it will be about the difficulties in the world, but then a lot of it's going to be kind of centering some of these solutions and centering kind of plot twisters as a case study, as a specific group that is trying to do things in the light of this. So I'll leave it at that. That's a super basic demo. If anybody has any questions, you can ask me, but we're probably out of time for that today. I'm actually going to be spending most of the weekend working on that stuff, so I'll have like more fun things to show next time.
Yeah.
As you work on it, I'm happy to jump in and leave comments.
Yeah, I think it would be really helpful to do that. I'm actually considering like I might just make a shared like a document, basically what we did with your notes, but just like here's the content, not necessarily the direct words, but like the notes version of what I want to talk about, and then having people write comments or questions or suggest books or whatever might be helpful for sure. So.
Yeah, it brought up a lot of things for me about AI security and ethical regulation and like co-creation of ethical systems kind of as they evolve and continual learning ideas. So yeah, I definitely also love to be able to talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Well, ideally by the end of this weekend, I'll have like a lot more fun stuff to show. But anyway, thank you. I feel like that was a little more time than I wanted to spend in that, but I'll turn the floor over to you, Bradley.
Yeah, well, I think that's good to go through a lot of this stuff, to make sure that people know, because we post things in the Slack and then they get lost and people don't know exactly what's involved in something. So this might foster a bit more collaboration by laying it out like this. I think it's very good. I think the shared interfaces, there's a lot of stuff too that we can define and refine and get things going, and there are a lot of concepts. I'm glad that we're kind of feeding, there's feedback between like some of our other discussions and the WeRobot stuff. So
yeah, and I guess I'll say quickly, as a different topic, there hasn't been a lot of other things going on outside of the WeRobot stuff. The majority, and I said this, and I'll briefly mentioning here, the majority of my spare time has been trying to get some of my organizational, like I'm basically trying to create a group that collects. There's nothing is like currently happening, but a place by which I can center a lot of the efforts I'm doing on like cognition futures, the mentoring stuff, plot twisters, to kind of have it just all in one space, and that could potentially offer some bureaucratic, or what's that word for, like not corporate, but just like a different structure under which to do or try to help support things.
right.
Like institutional support.
Yeah, like that, doing that stuff and like picking the name, even just down to actually finalizing a name. And I have a name now that I'm going to go with for a bit, and like website and like a lot of the nitty gritty stuff for that. And that has happened, and that's as it comes to development more, I'm going to share more about it. But like that will be a great load off of my mind, and then I'm looking forward to kind of the just to say it again here, like that group in and of itself is going to do nothing, but it's just like a group that helps show. Like when I go to, like, I'm basically like in the process of creating the web page for it, basically, and it's basically going to just be a name and a list of partners and projects, and maybe like a reference to myself or some other folks who are like the not executive board of it or whatever. And I could, like, being able to give people positions and being able to have a reference point and say, oh, we're supporting like orthogonal lab this way or plot twisters. Like there are certain things that I've seen a need for that, and there's certain things that are like I don't know, like in a administrative, but also like external. Sometimes you need the shield or the banner of some group to do things, and you don't like. I don't want to screw too much with like plot twisters, for example. I want to keep some things separate from them.
Right.
Or like even cognition futures, I want it to be like as is. I don't want to change it, but there's some other things that can be happening around it. So there's been progress on that front, and I'm happy about it. But that's my last update for today.
Okay.
If you ever need web stuff help, let me know. Because I've been doing that as a job for the last 20 years. So if you ever need help, let me know.
Okay, it's a pretty good, recommendation. I suppose I'll consider it. But yeah, no, that's cool. I appreciate that, Brian.
I mean, for what it's worth, I kind of hate doing it. That's kind of why I'm trying to get more into the AI field. Because it's so in the app, I'm sure you know. However, maybe I can help, if you need it.
Oh yeah, you got a lot of like that. Then that's something that wouldn't be happening for a while. Like you got so much to do. But yeah, I laughed in part because I totally relate. Like I don't do one of my older jobs isn't explicitly about design, but like website management, and it's like I don't like it either. It's like really boring, but it's been like okay. So I personally relate to that.
Totally. Yeah, no, I started when the web didn't even have JavaScript and it was just HTML pages. Like CSS was like the new thing. And so I've been doing that as a side hustle for so long. I've been watching the ecosystems get crazy and big. And it's amazing.
Yes.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse, for that. So I'm going to move on to some other things. And I talked about this, I think, yesterday. I alluded to it. But we have this area in the lab that's these contextual geometric structures. And we've talked about them in a number of talks. So this is something that we did last year at the Cultural Evolution Society. And then I've done some other... There was actually a GSOC project on this a while back, like in 2018, and we did some programming on it. But it's something that has been very hard to characterize, hard to implement in like a technology. So I have a paper from 2012 that goes back to some of the original ideas. But basically, what contextual geometric structures are, they're a way to characterize culture. And I think I may have talked about this in some of the previous meetings. But they're these structures that are sort of geometric. They have different poles on them, and they have these axes. And the axes are these sort of they're classifiers in and of themselves. And they're fuzzy classifiers, which means that anything that falls along a continuum, say this edge, will have a certain membership in that, in like from one point to another. So I'm going to give you an example here. This is kind of a busy diagram, but if you look at the three edges of these of this geometric object, you might have one axis that is like hot versus cold, another one which is light versus dark, and another one which is sweet versus savory, or something like that. And we're trying to classify, in this case, maybe like environmental state, or perceptual state, like you're looking at multi-sensory information. And so each of these points is sort of, actually has, either one or two, sort of the endpoints of one or two categories. And so if something falls along this axis here, and this is, I think, the light versus dark axis, if it's 100% light, it is going to be something that is extremely bright, and it's going to be 100% light. If it's 100% dark, it's going to be extremely dark. And you can use physical attributes of stimuli to calibrate this axis. Okay, so the idea would be it's extremely light, extremely dark, and then anything that falls along one of these lines has a membership in both the light category and the dark category. So if something falls up here, it might be 80% light and 20% dark, and it has a mix of attributes of each. So you can take something like a stimulus and describe it at least in two ways along that axis. You can say what its membership is in light, what its membership is in dark. Now you notice that it's an actual geometric structure. So this axis is paired with other axes. And so then, this point actually represents light, but it also represents hot, which is maybe a related term, but it refers to this axis where you have hot and cold, which again can be like the physical maximum of hot, the physical maximum of cold, and then everything along that. So if something is in the middle, it's 50% hot, 50% cold. And so that's the idea. And you have just the space where any one point within this space is going to register as a membership, as part of this membership function. So this space will have points with a membership function for 6 categories: hot, cold, light, dark, sweet, savory. All of those, it's going to have like a certain percentage or a certain membership. Now they don't have to be transitive. So you could have like something could be 40% hot and 60% cold, because we're talking about different physical attributes, maybe even a multi-dimensional sort of description, but it's on a single axis. So they don't have to be transitive. So they have these points within this space, and you just draw lines across from where they are on the continuum. And then you see that like not all of this continuum is represented by what the agent is experiencing. Experience is actually relegated to this smaller area, because as it turns out, a perceptual system isn't going to experience all of the extremes of the physical world. So, I don't say that like we have 100% light in the universe, 100% dark in the universe. The light and dark 100% membership is like maybe something that is experienced on the planet, but the perceptual systems of the agent, the experience of the agent is restricted to a certain range of these. And so what ends up happening is you end up getting these cultures that form. And the cultures are basically a bunch of agents that experience the same range or have experiences with the same membership function of these 3 axes kind of combined together. And then it's, that's where that population of agents falls. And so they just kind of tend to gravitate towards this circle, culture A, culture B. You have 2 populations of agents that are sort of have different experiences, and in this case they overlap somewhat, but they're distinct in terms of their mean distribution. And so this is a very quantitative way to deal with some of the attributes of a culture. So a culture is something that's shared, something that involves experience and practice, but it's ultimately something that's perceptual, that you can see. You have a perceptual experience and then you represent it somehow. There's practice involved. So we don't talk about practice, we talk more about the experience here, but it can be mapped to some sort of practice by the agent, that they do something. So these spaces are intriguing, and there's a lot of geometry that you can play with. So one of the things that you can do is map them to much more sophisticated geometries. So this is a triangle with 3 axes and they're linear. This is a circular axis. So this is where I've taken CMYK, which is a 32-bit representation of color. And so different colors that you might see in the environment. And they're mapped to this representational space. And so agents would again have the representation within the space, and there'd be different membership functions for each of these different color values. These are different components of color. And so this is where they get blended together. There's a different membership function for each color. And again, they don't have to be transitive. They don't have to add up to 1. They can be like, 60% C, 60% K, 20% M, and 70% Y. And then that's like some color, but then there's there are multiple aspects of the color that are being perceived. And so it's like, you have 1 point, actually there are kind of multiple points simultaneously, but that's because, you're seeing that the agent is perceiving a color physically, but then it's interpreting it a little bit differently. And so that's when you can have that kind of non-transitivity. And so you can have these spaces where you have your agent's experiences that are in the space, and they're being represented here. And so that's the common representation. You can also have, conceptual kernels and sensory kernels. So I've experimented a little bit with drawing these two kernels out. So one kernel is conceptual, meaning that this is where the concept space is. The other is where it's sensory. So in the sensory kernel, it might be transitive. The transitive rules apply. So you can get a good sort of, you have some mathematical rules that kind of govern what the sensory experience is. And then it maps to a conceptual kernel where it can be non-transitive and the values can range a lot more freely. And you can have this mapping between multiple concepts in a single sensory percept. So you can do this with different geometric structures. And these are mimicking sort of representations in the brain, but they're constraining it to this mathematical framework, this geometric framework. And the other presentation, I don't know if I have this slide in here, but there's this one here where you have these sort of, it's almost like homeomorphisms actually, where you have these spaces where you're mapping the different axes to different shapes. So this is a triangle and it's being mapped to this circle. This is if you want to incorporate new knowledge into your model. So for example, this agent is seeing the Statue of Liberty for the first time, and it needs to incorporate that into its mental model or its representation. So you have this representation of these different axes arranged in a triangle, and in this case that's arranged in an oval. So there's some curvature to the axis, and it's represented within this space. This is pretty abstract stuff, but I just wanted to bring it up because I know we've talked about some of these concepts of representations, and we've talked about some other things that were related to this, and I thought it might be interesting to people to kind of discuss that because we haven't discussed it much in the group. But so I'm looking to drive that area forward, maybe not as a primary thing, but it's something to kind of explore a little bit and kind of drive forward. Because I know people are doing a lot of stuff with they're trying to do cultural representations now and different things. We've talked about cultural representations in terms of heredity, but not like this. So this is just something that I've been working on. There's a lot more to this. I didn't want to get too deeply into it, but it's based on a lot of this work where, what we talked about in I think the GSOC group about different scales and representing things on different scales from 0 to 100 or from some positive to negative valence. And so this work kind of takes off from that kind of work where you have these visualizations that are different scales visualized, but also some of the work on conceptual blending, which has been in cognitive science where they've studied how concepts get blended in the mind. You'll have one concept and another concept, and you'll have a term that's like this horse is lit, which is the horse is fun or interesting or something or exciting, and then but lit means something else entirely, something different. Horse, could actually be some slang term, but you're mapping between two concepts, or actually more concepts. And so it does take off from that aspect too. But this is something that I've been trying to develop for years, and it's quite hard to like kind of apply to anything. But I thought I'd go over that in the meeting here.
But I noticed when I was reading the paper that you wrote about it, that it relates to Lagrangian coherent structures.
Yeah.
Which is really which have like tons of applications, right?
Yeah.
And I got wondering if the connection, like if the difficulty of implementation lies with and this might not be the correct terminology, but it lies with a mapping problem, like that Lagrangian coherent structures maybe map really well to physical systems, and we don't have good ways of reliably mapping cultural systems to physical systems.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love the coherent geometric structures ideas, and so
Yeah.
I'm desperately trying to understand homotopy type theory so that I can try to apply topological things to this idea, but I'm nowhere near there. I'm like 2 years out.
Yeah. Oh, Jesse asked, which type of theory did you mention?
I missed what Brian said. Which kind of type theory?
I'll send Wikipedia. Hold on. So there's a few different type theories, right? And the first one I believe was intuitionistic type theory, which eventually got cohered into Martin-Loff type theory, which is the same as like the Backus-Neuauer way of describing computer programming languages. So it's this idea that everything that you do has to have a witness and make a judgment. And so you say, for example, like, well, we say that the integers are defined that one follows each one in sequence, and that's how you know it's an integer, is if you can just, by adding one to each other, that'll be the definition of integer. And so you start there, so you kind of build up this whole world of different types. So if integer is a type, then a decimal number or a float number or a double number is another kind of type. So it's this way of kind of constructing proofs rather than just doing mathematics. There's the Wikipedia. That's probably more better. And so this guy Vladimir Blavatsky came up with kind of a generalization of the Martin-Loff and intuitionistic type theoretical ideas and connected them to topology in mathematics. Kind of said like, wait a second, I think that these can be connected. And so it's called homotopy type theory because at its core, we came up with this univalence principle, which is like basically universal extensionality, which meaning that like type theory, it applies to sets on the one hand, and then it applies to, I'm trying to think of what's above sets. I mean, basically it's a way, homotopy type theory is a way of looking at dimensionality of mathematical structures. So you like start with set theoretic ideas, and below that, I guess, is just formal logic. So we have formal, like yes, no, like not P and not P. And then above that, you have set theory, like collections of P's and not P's. And then above that, you have category or group theory, which is like how you collections of sets with more complex mathematical relationships between them. And then you can keep going above that and look at like several dimensional models of the world. So I feel like there's a way to connect this with contextual geometric structures. But like I said, I'm still studying this stuff and really. Yeah. I feel like I have a good enough understanding of it to kind of explain it, but not really work with it just yet.
Yeah, it's very, very, very hard to, yeah. I mean, the Lagrangian coherent structures aspect of it is kind of like when you have a bunch of agents and how do they form like these, like I showed you the cultures or the circles, how do they form that in this kind of space? So like, how do you get, is it a physical distribution or is it like a, and so, Lagrangian coherent structures kind of puts a dynamical systems cast on this sort of diffusive processes and these sort of you have like these shapes, these sort of higher order shapes, these ridges to structures, and it is kind of, when I wrote that paper, it was kind of hard for me to define clearly what the mapping was between some of these things in like a physical space. But I think it's kind of interesting how those things interact, because you're dealing with some physical concepts, but you can use those to sort of guide a lot of these other concepts. So anyways, I don't know. I just wanted to bring it up and mention that it existed, and that that's something. It's not one of those things that's like a long-term project for me. It's kind of like working out details in different directions, and seeing what really works and what doesn't. So
yeah, I don't think I have anything to say about it, but I've been playing around a bit with it through the presentation today in terms of some of the shared cognitive interface stuff.
Yeah.
I don't have any immediate things, but it's good. I'm glad you kind of brought that up in the context of me thinking about all that stuff.
Yeah. So just a quick overview of that. There's much more to say about it, but not today. So I wanted to finish up with something from our collection of papers. So let's see where we are. I think I will talk about this autotelic agents paper. This is something that Morgan brought to our attention. I think it was yesterday, but he put it in the Slack. I think it was in the Dev AI Slack, because it does deal with the sort of developmental AI perspective. And this is Pierre-Yves Odier, I think that's how you say his name, from INRIA in Paris. And he does a lot of stuff with like the developmental AI. He has his perspectives on it. It's a largely reinforcement learning perspective. And so this paper is autotelic agents with intrinsically motivated goal-conditioned reinforcement learning, a short survey. So the abstract, and I don't really know what autotelic means yet. I guess we'll find out, or maybe someone can put a good definition in the Slack or in the chat here. The abstract reads, building autonomous machines that can explore open-ended environments. We've talked about open-endedness, which is where there's no defined goal, and it's just that you evolve in certain directions. Discover possible interactions and build repertoires of skills is a general objective of artificial intelligence. Developmental approaches argue that this can only be achieved by autotelic agents, and this means intrinsically motivated learning agents. So they have some intrinsic motivation that can learn to represent, generate, select, and solve their own problems. So this is where they have to have some intrinsic motivation. So it has to be some motivational drive. You're not getting it necessarily from the environment, but it's sort of this autonomous thing. And you could think of it maybe as like we've talked about innateness or something else. There's, of course, intrinsic motivation in psychology, so that may be a source that you could model for that too. In recent years, the convergence of developmental approaches with deep reinforcement learning methods, so this is where they have some previous work on developmental approaches and deep reinforcement learning, has been leading to the emergence of a new field, developmental reinforcement learning. So this is developmental RL. So this field is concerned with the use of deep reinforcement learning algorithms to tackle a developmental problem. And that problem is the intrinsically motivated acquisition of open-ended repertoires of skills. So a repertoire of skills is like, things that you do. Like, so you could learn like basketball, and there are a bunch of skills that you learn in basketball or baseball. There are skills that you have to learn to play the game, and you learn them maybe through practice, or you could learn them through a sequence of acquisitions, but then you'd have to apply them to the actual game. So it's a matter of training, like, you go to batting practice, you go to catching practice, catch fly balls. Those skills then are transferred to the game setting where you're doing all this in real time. But the idea here is it's open-ended, so, it's not like you're not saying, here's a target, and match the target. And then, matching the target may not give you the ability to map it to the actual game setting. The self-generation of goals requires the learning of compact goal encodings, as well as their associated goal achievement functions. So they basically have to learn these compact encodings about the goals and their associated goal achievement functions. Then I talk about that in the paper. This raises new challenges compared to standard RL algorithms, originally designed to tackle predefined sets of goals using external reward signals. Now, we talked about this earlier in the NeuroMatch recap because these aren't reinforcement learning a lot, and they'll cover reinforcement learning a lot, and it has ties to psychology and sort of the psychology of motivations and maybe even addiction or things like that. But you have this little bit different way of thinking about a reinforcement learning algorithm, and that is that you usually think about at least the algorithmically in terms of policies. So policies are sets of behaviors that you want to implement given the feedback. So it's basically like, I get some feedback, I'll implement this policy, it'll work. This is where you have to kind of be more open-ended about it. So you don't want to necessarily implement a whole policy. It's kind of like, you don't really have a predefined set of goals. It's just like you encounter things in the environment, and then you have to apply what you know to that. And so this is very different. This is an open-ended version of the sort of the closed feedback loop we saw in the standard reinforcement learning paradigm. The present paper introduces developmental RL and proposes a computational framework based on goal-conditioned reinforcement learning, so conditioning on goals, to tackle the intrinsically motivated skills acquisition problem. It proceeds to present a typology of the various goal representations used in the literature, before reviewing existing methods to represent and prioritize goals in autonomous systems. We close the paper by discussing some open challenges in the quest of intrinsically motivated skills acquisition. So this kind of goes over a lot of this. It talks about like some of this. Here's a piece here. Across their lives, humans build a large repertoire of diverse skills from a virtually infinite set of possibilities. So it's a highly complex search space for these things. What is most striking, perhaps, is their ability to invent and pursue their own problems, using internal feedback to assess completion. So this doesn't necessarily rely on the environment. You're doing some sort of internal feedback without direct reference to an environment, although you interact with the environment to sort of see the possibilities. We would like to build artificial agents to demonstrate equivalent lifelong learning abilities. So there are two approaches that they can think of. Developmental approaches, which have been realized in developmental robotics, and then the intelligence should be embodied. Robots are often used to test this. This is why they use developmental robotics. And then, reinforcement learning is the other sort of approach. And then, let's see, I'm trying to find so reinforcement learning, on the other hand, is the field interested in problems where agents learn to behave by experiencing the consequences of their actions under the form of rewards and costs. As a result, these agents are not explicitly taught. They need to learn to maximize cumulative rewards over time by trial and error. So this is a key part of reinforcement learning, which is learning the reward structure. And I think we talked about that maybe last week or the week before, that there's like this situation where you can either have like an immediate gratification or an immediate reward or a delayed reward. And this has a difference in how the internal model of that is structured. Do you have this instantaneous feedback, or is it a delayed feedback and it's something that's cumulative? That's a very important point. And this, of course, has a lot to do with like the open-endedness of the problem. If you have something right in front of you that there's a reward and you can see the value of it, then it's easy to do like a very instantaneous feedback. Whereas if you have this sort of open-endedness, a cumulative reward function maybe makes more sense because it helps you explore the possibilities a little bit more and come up with an answer. And so there's this idea of intrinsic motivations, which is a set of brain processes motivating humans to explore for the mere purpose of experience, novelty, surprise, or learning progress. And we talked about that last week with the artificial novelty literature. And I think that's, so again, this is coming up. This is a very interesting area. They give some references here. Alice and Gopnik is one, and some of the other papers by this group here that we're featuring is also part of this. And so, integrating this is, of course, what they want to do. That's their goal. And then I don't know if there are any good figures in here, but they talk about these intrinsic motivations. They're knowledge-based intrinsic motivations, which are about prediction, and they're competence-based intrinsic motivations, which are about control. And so those give you two different things: prediction, finding out what's next, what's in a sequence of events, what do we expect, and then control, which is being able to use those predictions to do some task with accuracy and efficiency. And so and then we propose to use the adjective autotelic from the Greek auto, self, and telos, end goal. So this is like the end goal isn't out in the environment. It's actually in the internal model here. So it's like the goal is like whatever we think is, we're building this cumulative reward function, and then we think about the goal. It's not in the environment, it's in the self. So that's what they mean by autotelic. So this is intrinsically motivated processes here, and goal-conditioned neural agents, and they're trying to merge these two areas together. So they actually give a nice review of some of these, some of the things that people have done in the past. There are all these different approaches: MAP elites, SAG, REACT, RIG, discern. So you can see all these acronyms with cute names, but basically there are all these different approaches to these different things. So they're trying to merge these two areas together in this paper. And then they have these definitions here. And they really do get into the link between psychology and reinforcement learning. So goals in a psychology context, is different from the goals in reinforcement learning context. And so you want to make sure you differentiate between those two. And so to represent goals, RL agents must be able to have a compact representation of them and to assess their progress towards it. That's why we propose a formalization for RL goals. And they give this mathematical formalization where there's a goal embedding, a goal achievement function, goal parameterizer, goal condition reward functions. So they have all these, they give the details in this in an external table, so you can actually get a sense of how they're computing this. And then they go to the multi-goal reinforcement learning problem, which is dealing with multiple goals once they define single goals. And then I don't know if there's anything more in the paper that's really can't miss, but basically they put all this together, and they this is a review, so they don't really have a lot of results. In this survey, we call autotelic any architecture where the agent selects its own goals. So this is where the agent is actually selecting its own goals instead of having goals out in the environment that it wants to pursue. And so this is, again, the agent, the internal aspect of it, the goal generator, the goal reward function, the goal condition policy, and the environment dynamics. So they use policies here, but it's a little bit different. Instead of going as a feedback loop between the environment and the agent and then having the policies out here to select from, the policy is formed from the internal model of the state space, the goal space that is encountered or is imagined, and then it's all within the agent. So there's only sort of feedback from the environment, but it's only to make sure that it's based in reality. So this is a little bit different approach for this. So I think that's there are other things in there like how to make a goal into a abstraction and things like that. But it's a very good paper. I'll put it in the Slack. But I wanted to get some comments.
I was curious about that.
Yeah.
I didn't see it in the Slack, but yeah.
Oh, I think it's in one of the channel, like Developmental AI or something. I can get it in the general though.
Yeah, I think
Okay. Oh, yeah.
I'm glad that my assumption about autotelic was correct, though. When I first read it, I was like, oh, like a teleology that kind of has its own, like, its own impetus, or I'm not sure what the right word is, but.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think the diagram at the end was actually really useful. Like, it just, like, because I was curious how they're going to relate it to, like, the feedback loop. It's like, you just have this stuff. It's sort of like it feels a bit like, to anthropomorphize it, it's a bit like being just very single-minded. Like, you have it's just like your motivation is like, does it, because I kind of missed some of the paper, but does it talk about how the agent, well, the RL, I guess in this case, how does it is it select a goal from a set of options, or like what's the actual goal generation aspect of it inside of its?
Yeah, so let me share my screen again. I think it's a state space that they consult. So like there's a state space that's built out of like all the different things in the environment, and there's some set of goals that's extracted from that. So you have it's kind of like a landscape of some type. I'm trying to find the figure.
So the state space is like environmentally perceived.
Well, I think this is more like a sampling distribution of goal space. And so, your goals are anything out in the environment. There are many, many things you could have as goals. And then there's a generative model here that kind of puts them into a space. There's some embedding of maybe things that are more likely than others. And then there's this reward function policy. So the goals that are more rewarding, it might be, selected for or reinforced. And then you interact with the environment, and I don't really know how this is actually implemented. It could be that as you encounter things, if it matches something that's generated by the goal space, it kind of knows how to deal with it. It knows what the reward is. But sometimes you have to, because you don't encounter everything in the environment, right? If you're an agent and you're walking through the environment, you get like different things that have a different reward at a certain point in time. Sometimes things have a different reward over time. Sometimes you don't encounter everything, so you encounter a subset of this space. But if you model a space, from sampling, from generative methods, you get a better handle on what's out there, and then you get an estimate of what the reward is. And then as you interact with it, you have a better idea of what the true value of something, as opposed to like just an immediate impression, which is maybe more useful if you if you think that tomatoes are poisonous and you operate on that assumption all the time, versus like if there are different types of tomatoes, maybe some are poisonous, some are not. So there's a little bit better handle on what the actual reward is for this thing that you're encountering. But I could be wrong about how that works. But I think it's not really single-mindedness. It's like you're generating an internal model of goal space. You're generating some candidate rewards. You're kind of figuring that out, and then you're going out in the environment and interacting with things. So this is probably generated by environmental interactions, but the reward isn't really fully realized until you actually learn something. But you can actually model this and have a good sense of what something should be in the environment. So if you encounter variations on a theme, like different types of tomato, what is the reward? Is it poisonous? Is it not poisonous? And then you're going to need good old-fashioned knowledge to be sure. But this is one way to kind of explore the environment and get some sort of down and dirty heuristic answer.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so there are 4 comments in the chat. Okay, so Jesse asked some. Oh yeah, and thank you, Brian, for putting a definition in there. Jesse said additional web context. So this is from this contextual geometric structure stuff. Then do living organisms have autotelic motivation that isn't environmentally driven? So yeah, the answer would be, I would imagine, yes. Just because you're modeling all possibilities in the environment, but you're also kind of, that space has it gives you a wider range of kind of a mental model of what's out there. So I guess it isn't driven by like pure experience. Don't tell Allen Iverson about learning basketball through practice. Okay.
So that's a very specific reference to when he went on a rant. Is an older. That's like a very dated old comment.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah. Anyway, no. I had the autotelic comment at the start of the presentation, and it's been really interesting. I feel like I'm glad that paper's in the Dev AI channel, because I feel like that's we had a conversation a while ago, even at Chicago, but like even in one of those meetings last time, like it may be more on the front burner in a few months after everything else past WeRobot era, but I think Dev AI will be kind of a returning to, even with the CGS stuff, honestly, like returning to kind of fleshing that out might be something that takes it more center stage as the year turns. So
yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for attending this meeting this week. Next week we'll have another meeting. I don't know if anyone has anything they want to present at that time. Hopefully, we keep going in this direction with our momentum. I'm looking forward to seeing if Amanda has some things she wants to maybe present on, or Jesse or Brian. Hopefully, we have some things to want to follow up on too. So I'll have an eye towards that. All right. Have a good week.
take care.
Thank you.
You
Take
do.
care.